In the summer of 1948, a 21-year-old art student from Oregon arrived at Black Mountain College in North Carolina to study painting. His name was Kenneth Snelson, and within a few weeks of arriving, he had abandoned painting entirely. Not because he lost interest in art, but because he heard a lecture that sent him in a completely different direction. The man giving the lecture was Buckminster Fuller, architect, engineer, inventor of the geodesic dome. In short, one of the most aggressively visionary thinkers of the 20th century. Fuller was not a modest person. He spoke for 3 hours that evening about tension and compression, about the structural principles underlying all forms in nature, about the possibility of a new kind of architecture that worked with natural forces rather than against them. Snelson was so taken by what he had heard that he went back to his room and spent the night trying to build physical models of what Fuller has described. What came out of that night was something Fuller had not actually described because it didn't exist yet. Snelson built a small sculpture, two X-shaped pieces of plywood connected by a web of fine cables, arranged so that the rigid pieces didn't touch each other at any point. The whole structure floated together in a state of balanced tension. The rigid components pushed outward while the cables pulled inward, and the result was a thing that was simultaneously delicate and stable precisely because it was in tension. When Snelson showed it to Fuller, Fuller studied it, turned it over in his hands and asked if he could take it home. The next day, Fuller told Snelson he had the configuration wrong, had him rebuild it, and then had his photograph taken with the new version. That photo later appeared in magazines and lectures without Snelson's name attached to it. Fuller would go on to claim an increasingly central role in the discovery, while Snelson spent decades disputing this. The argument between them, who discovered what and when, was never fully resolved. What Fuller did do, which Snelson never disputed, was to name the thing. In the mid-1950s, he coined the word tensegrity, a compression of tensional integrity achieved by continuous tension and discontinuous compression. Islands of compression in the sea of tension. The rigid elements don't stack on top of each other the way bricks in a wall do. They float, each one held in place by the pull of everything around it. Fuller believed it was the underlying principle of all stable structures in nature, from the geodesic dome to the atom. He was prone to this kind of claim, but in this particular case, he was pointing at something real, and it would take several more decades before the people who study the human body begin to turn to this model. To understand what tensegrity has to do with the body, you first need to understand the model it was meant to replace. The dominant model of the human body in Western anatomy for roughly 500 years goes back to Andreas Vesalius, the Flemish physician who in 1543 published the Humani Corporis Fabrica, the first rigorous anatomical atlas based on actual human dissection rather than the inherited texts of Galen. Vesalius' work was a genuine revolution. It corrected centuries of accumulated error, and the method he used became the foundation of Western anatomical knowledge. It was careful, systematic dissection of the cadaver. The problem with dissection as a method is that it is also by nature a destruction. To see what is inside, you cut, and cutting separates things that in a living body are continuous. The scalpel sliding between a muscle and its neighboring tissue destroyed the very connection it is trying to reveal. So anatomy, as it is developed from Vesalius onward, built its model of the body around what survived the blade and largely discarded what it destroyed at the process of looking. Fascia is connective tissue. It is the white, fibrous, slightly translucent material that anyone who has prepared a raw chicken had encountered and peeled away. Anatomists doing cadaver dissections scraped it off and threw it into the bucket with the other discarded material for centuries. It was considered packaging, the wrapping that held things in place but was not itself significant. For centuries, the standard anatomy curriculum trained students to remove it in order to see the structures underneath. What this meant in practice was that the entire connective tissue architecture of the body, the continuous three-dimensional web of collagen fibers that runs from the soles of the feet to the top of the skull, surrounding and threading through every muscle, every organ, every bone, forming a single, unbroken system, was being systematically removed from every anatomy lesson ever taught. Generation after generation of physicians, surgeons, physical therapists, and movement practitioners learned a body from which the fascia had been cleared away before they arrived. Thomas Myers, the body worker and author of Anatomy Tract, described fascia as the Cinderellas of body tissue, systematically ignored and discarded. The person who looked at this most directly and earliest was a biochemist from the Bronx named Ida Rolf, who was born in 1896. She earned her PhD in biological chemistry from Columbia University in 1920, at a time when female PhDs in science were vanishingly rare. She spent the following 12 years at the Rockefeller Institute publishing research in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, eventually reaching the rank of associate, a significant achievement in that environment. She took a leave of absence to study mathematics and atomic physics in Zurich and used her weekends in Geneva to study homeopathic medicine. She was clearly someone who followed her questions wherever they led, regardless of disciplinary boundaries. What drove her ultimately was practical. She had health problems of her own that conventional medicine could not resolve, and one of her sons had motor difficulties that no doctor could help with. She spent the 1930s working her way through every alternative system she could find: osteopathy, chiropractic, yoga, the Alexander technique, and Alfred Karzybski's work on how states of consciousness relate to the body. Somewhere in all of this, she arrived at the question that would organize the rest of her life: what conditions would allow the human body to be fully organized in gravity so that it could function with minimum effort? The answer she developed was unusual for its time. She believed the body structure was not primarily determined by its bones and muscles. That were important but secondary. What organized the whole system, in her eyes, what held everything in relationship, was a fascial web. And crucially, she believed the fascial web was plastic, that it could be reorganized through manual pressure applied by skilled hands. She held the idea that the body structure was a record of history, of habitual patterns, and all injuries and compensations built on compensations, and that that record could be rewritten. She began practicing in a Manhattan apartment in 1940s, working with people who had been told nothing more could be done for them. By the 1960s, she had developed her 10 series, a structured sequence of 10 sessions that systematically worked through the entire body, releasing and reorganizing the fascial web from the most superficial layers down to the deepest. She called the work structural integration. Everyone else called it Rolfing. The invitation that changed her reach came in the mid-1960s from Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, who was running the SLN Institute in Big Sur, California. SLN was at that moment one of the most intellectually strange and productive places in America, a residential center where physiologists, philosophers, body workers, and spiritual practitioners all worked alongside each other with a shared interest in human potential and consciousness. Rolf fit there perfectly, and she knew it. She began teaching in SLN, trained her first group of practitioners, and established the Rolf Institute of Structural Integration in Boulder, Colorado in 1971. Ida Rolf was difficult, demanding, and frequently funny. She called people sparkers and had no patience for vagueness. Once she reportedly told a practitioner who was being overly cautious, "Don't be so polite with the body, it's tougher than you think." Her intuition, stated repeatedly and with increasing conviction over the years, was the phrase that her students passed among themselves like a cone: everything is connected. She died in 1979 at 83 years old. She never saw the scientific vindication of her central intuition, which was still decades away. The vindication came from an unlikely direction, from cell biology. Donald Ingber was a Harvard scientist who in the 1970s and 80s was studying how cells maintain their shape and how they respond to mechanical forces. The conventional model treated the cell as a fluid-filled bag, a membrane surrounding liquid cytoplasm with the nucleus floating somewhere in the middle. What Ingber found in his experiments did not fit this model. He saw that cells behaved as if they had an internal architecture, a structural framework that determined not just their shape, but how they communicated mechanical signals across their interior. In 1975, while he was still a student at Yale, Ingber encountered a tensegrity sculpture in an art building on campus. He stopped in front of it and, by his own account, realized immediately that he was looking at the model that explained what he was seeing in his cells. The cytoskeleton, the network of protein filaments inside the cell, operated on tensegrity principles. Some elements were in compression while others were in continuous tension. The stability of the whole came from the balance between them, not from any rigid framework, and mechanical forces applied to any part of the structure were transmitted immediately throughout the whole system. His paper on cellular integrity, published in Scientific American in 1998 under the title The Architecture of Life, brought the idea to a wide scientific audience for the first time. What Inber was arguing is that tensegrity operates as a structural principle at every scale of biological organization, from the molecular scaffolding inside a single cell up to the organization of the musculoskeletal system as a whole. Meanwhile, an orthopedic surgeon named Stephen Levin had been arriving at the same conclusion from a completely different direction. Levin had noticed, working clinically, that the conventional model of the skeleton as a compression structure, bones stacked on top of each other like columns transmitting force straight down through the stack, would not fully account for how the body actually behaves under load. Bones are not stacked, they float in the continuous networks of soft tissue, and the forces moving through the musculoskeletal system travel through that soft tissue network in ways that the column model could not explain. Levin introduced the term biotensegrity in the 1990s to describe the application of tensegrity principles specifically to biological structures. In the tensegrity model of the body, no bone directly touches another under normal conditions. They are separated and suspended by the continuous tension of muscles, ligaments, tendons, and fascia. The skeleton does not behave as a column. It is more like Snelson's floating sculpture, rigid elements held apart by a web of continuous tension, stable because of the tension, capable of distributing force through the entire system rather than concentrating it at specific contained points. This matters enormously for how we understand movement and the body. In the column model, a problem in one area of the body is a local problem. The structure at that point has failed. In the tensegrity model, a problem anywhere in the system changes the tension pattern throughout the whole web. A restriction in the fascia of the foot can alter the tension line running up through the calf, the hamstring, the low back, and all the way up to the neck. The body compensates for the restrictions by reorganizing the tension patterns globally. What presents as neck pain might be a compensation response to something happening all the way down the chain. Thomas Myers spent years mapping these lines of myofascial continuity, tracing the chains of connected tissue that run through the body in specific patterns, transmitting force and communicating tension from one region to another. His book Anatomy Trains describes 12 major myofascial meridians. He uses that word deliberately, noting the structural parallel with the traditional Chinese medicine system of meridians, which was built from clinical observations of exactly the same continuities that modern dissection is only now beginning to confirm. This parallel is worth noticing. A system of the body knowledge developed in China over centuries of empirical observation without the benefit of dissection mapped lines of connection through the body that Western anatomy completely missed. The scalpel and the accumulated clinical observation arrived eventually at the same territory from opposite directions. What is still genuinely unsettled is how far the implications run. There is solid scientific ground here. Fascia contains nerves, which means it has sensory capacity. It has been shown to have contractile properties too, similar in some ways to smooth muscle, which means it is not a passive packaging but an active participant in how the body moves and how it responds to stress. It communicates mechanical signals throughout the entire extent. A pull in one point is felt in some sense everywhere. Jean-Claude Gimbertot, a French hand surgeon, used video endoscopy during surgery to film living fascia tissue at a microscopic scale for the first time, and what he showed looked like nothing in any anatomy textbook. An irregular, fractal, glistening architecture of fibers in constant micro-movement, nothing like the flat sheets that cadaver dissection had suggested. The first International Fascia Research Congress was held at Harvard Medical School in 2007, bringing together researchers from biomedicine, manual therapy, and movement science for the first time to share what was already a sustained and rapidly growing body of work. It has continued every few years since. Fascia went from being the thing that gets thrown in a bucket to having its own dedicated research congresses, its own peer-reviewed journal, and its own growing presence in surgical training. Where the ground becomes less solid and where the movement and bodywork communities sometimes get ahead of the evidence is in the specific claims about what can be changed through manual therapy and how. Rawls' intuition that the fascial web could be reorganized through manual pressure has been partially confirmed. Fascia does respond to mechanical input. It does remodel over time, and some of the benefits reported by people who receive rolfing and similar work are supported by research. But the precise mechanisms are still being worked out. How much of the change is happening in the fascia itself, how much is in the nervous system's relationship to the tissue, and how much proprioceptive awareness and movement habits are still open questions. The clinical results are real, but the explanation for them is still being refined. This is where we actually are with fascia and tensegrity, past the point of dismissal, but not yet at full scientific consensus. A paradigm in the middle of shifting. What makes this story unusual in the history of the body is how it developed. It did not follow the usual path of scientific discovery, going through hypothesis, experiment, confirmation, and adaptation, but ran in parallel streams. A sculptor in North Carolina discovering a structural principle that he couldn't fully formalize. An architect taking that principle and adapting it to everything in the universe. A biochemist in Manhattan developing a whole body practice built on an intuition that science would take decades to catch up with. A cell biologist in the Yale Art Building having a realization that changed the direction of his research career. An orthopedic surgeon noticing that the standard model of the skeleton didn't match what he was seeing in the clinic. None of these people were primarily talking to each other. The streams ran separately for a long time, and then slowly the connections became visible. The way connections in the tensegrity structure become visible only when you look at the whole thing rather than any single component. Ida Roll's phrase, "it's all connected," was not a scientific claim when she said it. It was an intuition built from years of pulling her hands on bodies and noticing what happened. The science has been catching up to it ever since, and it has not finished catching up yet. The body, it turns out, was never the collection of separate parts that the anatomy textbooks describe. It was always a continuous, interconnected system present in every body that ever lived, waiting for someone to look at it without first cutting it apart.